Welcome to our reading on the firm and market structures. Now we start with an LOS that says describe the characteristics of market structures, and you'll notice we range from perfect competition through to monopoly. And in fact that's really what the rest of this reading is about, describing each one of these in turn. So you can really review this slide and think of it as a summary slide, a really good little revision tool to make sure you can describe all these features and you know why. So let's just quickly run through these, but we're going to see them in more detail later. So first of all, we look at the number of sellers, the number of firms. Notice in perfect competition we have many firms, through to monopoly where we have a single firm. We then have barriers to entry, very low for perfect competition, through to very high for monopoly. Now again, the significance of barriers to entry will be economic profit. If you generate economic profit in the short run, under perfect competition, that's going to increase. That's going to lead to an increase in the number of competitors, and therefore industry supply will increase, price will come down, and economic profits will be eroded. So think low barriers to entry, unsustainable economic profit; high barriers to entry, sustainable economic profit. With perfect competition, we also talk about the goods that each firm supplies being homogeneous, i.e. they're all very, very close in nature. Compare that, of course, through to monopoly, where you have no substitutes. Now, the nature of competition we're going to see under perfect competition is price only, essentially. We're going to talk about perfect competition being price takers. They have to accept the price and they face a perfectly elastic demand curve. Whereas monopoly, of course, their competition, well, because they have no competition in terms of firms, it's going to be a lot of advertising to try and attract customers rather than fighting off your competitors. So notice with perfect competition, we say pricing power is zero. They are price takers and they have to accept the market price. Again, we'll explain all these terms in more detail when we look at each structure in turn. With monopoly, we talk about them essentially establishing the market price. They establish their profit maximizing quantity, and that determines the price that they can charge. Okay, so let's start off with perfect competition. Our LOS here is explain and describe, and you'll notice that that will go through most of this reading, explain and describe these various market structures. So we start off with perfect competition. And here's that phrase that we talked about earlier. These firms are price takers. In other words, they're forced to take the market price. They've got no influence. Why? They have a perfectly elastic demand curve. And again, there's that point there, perfectly elastic demand curve. What that means is if they increase their price, essentially their customers would switch to the competition. So demand would drop to zero. We'll also see that if they decrease their price, they would make economic losses and go out of business. Therefore, they're forced to accept the market price. Okay, so they take the equilibrium market price, which is driven by supply and demand in the marketplace as a whole. The characteristics, homogeneous product. In other words, our product is identical to our competitors. Again, that helps give us that elastic demand curve. When we start to find differentiated products, the demand curve starts to slope downwards. Large number of independent firms. Now the key to this point is we're saying no one firm can affect the marketplace itself. Perfectly elastic demand curve, as we said, with homogeneous product and a large number of sellers, we get this perfectly elastic demand curve, perfectly horizontal if you like, and therefore if a firm increases price, they have no demand at all as customers switch to their competitors. Decrease in price, they go out of business. Now notice no barriers to entry or exit. Key point with this, therefore, is if economic profit is generated in the short run, you'll attract competition, that competition will increase industry supply, and in the long run, the economic profit will be eroded, and we'll see that graphically in just a while. So economic profits are not sustainable under perfect competition. So let's have a look at the short run for perfect competition. Remember, we said it is possible to make an economic profit in the short run. Now our firm is going to price where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The additional revenue from selling one extra unit is equal to the cost of producing it. Now remember, because they have a perfectly elastic demand curve, that marginal revenue is the same as average revenue and is the same as demand. This is the only model that we look at where marginal revenue and the demand curve are one and the same, and it's purely because of this perfect elasticity. Now notice their pricing here they're going to set quantity, profit maximizing quantity, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that determines the price. Now let's put on the average total cost curve, and on it goes. Now notice we're making economic profit here. Why? Well, when we look at this particular firm, here is the average cost of producing its units, and here is essentially the price. So let me try and make that a little bit more clear. So here essentially we have the cost, average cost per unit there, and price there. In other words, price is greater than the average cost, the difference being economic profit, as noted on our diagram in the grey box. But remember, only in the short run. Problem with this economic profit is it's combined in perfect competition with low barriers to entry, so therefore we're going to attract competition. Let me just clear that writing. Okay, so we're saying we'll make zero economic profit if price is equal to average total cost. We'll make economic losses if price is less than average total cost. And in our diagram here, we're making economic profit because price is greater than average total cost. Okay, now let's talk about perfect competition and equilibrium. Now, essentially, remember what we say here is, in the long run, economic profit cannot be made. And therefore, if you're making economic profit in the short run, industry supply increases, economic profits are eroded. So notice our firm in the long run, notice at this point here where they're taking the market price, notice again the profit maximizing quantity will always be marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That sets price, but also notice that the average total cost curve goes through this point. In other words, we're saying in this diagram that price equals average total cost at our red dot there. In other words, no economic profit can be made in the long run. Now, we're also asked to be aware of the firm versus industry short-run supply curves, and we're looking at the firm first of all. Now, if you remember back in a previous reading, we talked about the the firm supply curve as being its marginal cost curve above average variable cost. Now, essentially, if price is below average variable cost, it makes sense to shut down and avoid your variable costs. Remember, fixed costs are unavoidable in the short run, but you can avoid average variable costs. So anywhere between our original red dot and P1, price is insufficient to cover fixed and variable costs. Because we can avoid the variable cost, we'll shut down. Now, between P1 and P2, notice price is above average variable cost, so we're covering our variable costs now, but not covering our fixed costs. Now, we talk about, once price is above average variable cost, we talk about the firm having positive contribution. It's beginning to pay off some of its fixed costs. So whilst it isn't profitable, it still makes sense to produce in the short run. So notice, therefore, that the industry or the market supply curve starts to occur above P1 as firms now start to produce, even though they're not profitable. Now, of course, once we go above P2, the firm is now covering both its variable and its fixed costs, and of course making profit. Okay, now let's talk about a short-run increase in demand. Now remember, with perfect competition, we're going to start off at a point where no economic profit is being made, i.e. price is equal to average total cost. Okay, and remember, the price in the marketplace is set by the industry's or the market's supply and demand curve, and that establishes the firm's price. We are price takers, remember. So demand is going to shift up for whatever reason in this industry. So up goes demand, and notice when that happens, price increases. Now, if we were making zero economic profit at P1, if the price goes to P2, we should make economic profit. Price should now be greater than average total cost. Now, of course, if price is greater than average total cost, in the long run, we will attract new competitors. Okay, now, of course, if we're attracting competitors, then industry supply will increase until the price falls back to P1 and economic profits are eroded. Notice, of course, if we're making economic losses in the short run because price is below average total cost, then firms will exit the industry, and in this case, supply would contract, forcing the price back to P1. Okay, so let's have a look at the effects of a permanent increase in demand. So we're going to look at short run, the economic profit being created, and long run, it being eroded. So notice we're starting off in a point where essentially price equals average total cost. There are no economic profits for the firm. Let's shift our industry demand. So up it goes. The price now moves up, and you'll notice at this new level of quantity, you'll notice essentially that the price now is above average total cost. Here's our price, and here's our average total cost. So price is clearly above the average total cost. So economic profits are going to be made. There's our average total cost and price, and those are our economic profits. Now we know that those economic profits will attract competition. And as the competitors start to produce, industry supply will increase. So next, we're going to shift out our industry supply. And when that happens, industry price falls until eventually the economic profits are eliminated. So notice industry price then falls as supply goes up. Price comes back down for the firm, eliminating the economic profits. Oh, we've got a little example. Let's have a look at this. Cost and output problem. For Acme Corporation, it's a price taker, i.e. perfect competition. The market price of their product permanently falls below average total cost, but is above average variable cost and marginal cost. In the short run and the long run, what would happen? Now, key, of course, is to look at the price compared to the costs, the average variable and the average total. Remember, price below average variable cost, shut down. Price above average variable cost, operate in the short run, but you would go bankrupt in the long run because you need to cover all costs in the long run. Price above average total cost, which is fixed and variable, and of course you're making profits. So we're told that it's below average total cost, but above average variable cost. So we will operate in the short run, but in the long run, we would go out of business because we don't cover all of our costs. So the answer should be C. Right, let's turn our attention to monopolistic competition. Okay, now what we're saying is we've still got a large number of firms here, each with a small market share. Yes, they're going to be concerned about average price. Collusion between them is not possible. Okay, so they're all acting independently. They're not coming together to set industry quantity and industry price. Now, the second bullet point here is key. These firms produce differentiated products. So they're close to the competitors, but not perfect substitutes. Now, what that means is they're going to have an elastic demand curve, but unlike perfect competition, it's not going to be perfectly elastic. So it will be downward sloping to some extent. Now, as soon as we get downward sloping demand curves, marginal revenue now is no longer the same as the demand curve. Okay, so these firms are going to be competing on price, quantity, and marketing. Notice we still have low barriers to entry, and immediately when I see that, I think, oh, okay, if economic profits are going to be generated, that's going to attract competition, and that will erode those economic profits in the long run. So let's have a little bit of a look at this. Again, the key will be economic profits are possible in the short run, but not the long run. Now, profit maximization for the firm is going to be the same as before, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, where the additional revenue from selling one extra unit equals the cost to produce it. So that's going to establish profit maximizing quantity, where MR equals MC. There's MR, there's MC, and there is the profit maximizing quantity. Now you extend your line up until you hit your demand curve and across, and that gives you price. Go up the dotted quantity line until we hit the average total cost curve, and that gives us average total cost. And you can see that price is above average total cost, so in the short run, this firm is generating economic profits. Now, of course, that attracts competition, and when it attracts competition, industry supply will start to increase, prices will start to come down, until eventually, in the long run, price will equal average total cost and economic profits are eroded. And you can see we've got that in our long run diagram, and you can see our key point is here. Notice that price equals average total cost. Now, what I would say as well, notice another difference that we had compared to perfect competition. With perfect competition, in the long run, the firm was producing at the minimum of the average total cost curve, which essentially is here on our diagram. Whereas note, in the long run, with monopolistic competition, they're producing in the long run at that point, not at the minimum of the average total cost curve. So they're not minimizing their costs. There's our economic profit being eroded. Lovely. Okay, so yes, we've talked about this. Firms face downward sloping elastic demand curves, but they're not perfectly elastic. Now, there is a social cost. We didn't produce where price equaled marginal cost. Okay, so we didn't produce where price equaled marginal cost, and therefore there's going to be some inefficiencies in terms of deadweight losses. There's a social cost. We didn't minimize the cost of the firm. Notice we say the long run average total cost was not minimized, even in the long run, whereas under perfect competition, it was. Notice we say excessive advertising may take place. Why? Because these firms are producing close but not perfect substitutes, and therefore they're going to spend money on advertising to try and out-differentiate the competitor and attract customers. So note, fewer producers could be more efficient. However, because they're all producing differentiated products, you get increased diversity, and that of course can have value to customers. Okay, I'm not too excited about this slide, but be aware that brand names provide signals about quality. We tend to buy branded goods. You know, I've got a nice Longines Swiss watch on me. I paid a higher price because that brand name signaled quality to me. Okay, so let's talk about this level of efficiency here. Brand names do provide signals about quality. That's why in our monopolistic competition, it did tend to lead to increases in advertising as a way of trying to differentiate your product, to try essentially to make your demand curve less elastic and more inelastic. But we know product innovation and differentiation caused by having a lot of different suppliers in the industry has value to consumers. But what about advertising? Does it really add value? Well, the argument is, on one side, advertising is a fixed cost. It increases your fixed cost, it increases your total cost. We argue advertising is a fixed cost because it doesn't vary directly in line with sales. Now, of course, the plus side of advertising is hopefully you're making your demand curve more inelastic and less elastic and increasing your sales. Now, because of this, you might find that average total cost will decline because average fixed cost will fall. Now, let's just talk about that point in a bit more detail. Remember, fixed costs, total fixed cost does not vary in line with sales, but average fixed cost is total fixed cost divided by quantity. So essentially, if the advertising greatly increases sales, whilst you've got an increase in fixed costs, you've got a big increase in quantity, so we may find average fixed costs, and as a result, average total costs could decline. Okay, so let's compare perfect competition and monopolistic competition and talk about the inefficiencies that we're going to see here. Now, here's our monopolistic competition. Certainly in the short run, we might, and the long run, we'll find them producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In the short run, that could lead to economic profit. In the long run, of course, it shouldn't. So, notice essentially there is the efficiency loss that we were talking about, because our firm is going to produce at Q, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that is not at the minimum point on the average total cost line. Okay, so we talk about their profit maximizing quantity being lower than the efficient quantity. Notice the efficient quantity, therefore, is the quantity that minimizes the firm's average total cost curve point. Okay, now, if it minimizes average total cost, it will always be at the point where marginal cost hits the average total cost curve. Remember, we said if marginal cost is below average total cost, producing more reduces the average. Marginal cost is above average total cost, producing more increases the average. So marginal cost by default will always cross the average total cost curve at its minimum point, which is the efficient level. Now, of course, we know our firm is also making economic profit because price is greater than average total cost. So we're not at the efficient quantity and our firm makes economic profit. Now, of course, compare that to perfect competition. And of course, especially in the long run with perfect competition, we're going to find no economic profit is made. Of course, remember, with monopolistic competition, in the long run, that economic profit will be eroded. But essentially, in the long run, we will just end up at this point here, so price will equal average total cost. We're still not going to be producing at the efficient quantity. Whereas under perfect competition, notice price equals average total cost, and that's at the minimum of the average total cost curve. So they are producing at the efficient quantity. We next turn our attention to oligopoly, where we have a small number of sellers, okay, and as a result, a downward sloping demand curve. Again, we've got differentiated products, and our demand curve is becoming less elastic and more inelastic. Now, the key here with oligopoly is you have interdependence amongst the competitors. In other words, the quantity produced by one competitor affects price, and it affects the quantity that another competitor could produce. Now, what we're going to therefore say is that we know that what the industry demand curve is, but because of the independence amongst the competitors, each competitor doesn't know their own demand curve, okay? Because their demand curve will be affected by the actions of their competitor. We're going to have significant barriers to entry. Now, I see that phrase, significant barriers to entry, and immediately I'm thinking, ooh, economic profits are going to be sustainable in the long run. Notice products may be similar or differentiated. Typically, though, we tend to find fairly similar products. We tend to find oligopolies in things like the oil industry, for example. Now, the first model we're going to look at excuse me, is the kinked demand model. And we're going to have a kinked demand curve. So let's put on our kinked demand curve. Now, notice PK there is the market price. Now notice, if the firm raises its price above PK, then it's on a very elastic part of the demand curve. Why? Essentially, people will switch to their competitors. So they find very elastic demand. So if they increase their price, quantity demanded falls by a bigger proportion. Now notice, if they reduce their price below PK, then the demand curve looks far more inelastic. In other words, price falls, but quantity demanded does not increase by a bigger proportion. It actually increases by a smaller proportion. Why is this the case? Because if they cut their prices, their competitors will follow that price cut. So they don't see the benefit in terms of dramatically increased quantities. Now, you also do get the kind of unique situation here that we have a kind of gap in our marginal revenue curve for the firm. There we go, we get our gap essentially there, a discontinuous marginal revenue curve. Okay, Nash equilibriums we need to talk about. Okay, the choices of all firms are such that no other choice makes any firm better off. That is the key line there. No other choice makes anybody better off. Okay, so we're at an equilibrium. We can't increase our profits or reduce our losses. Now we're going to look at some strategic games, such as Cournot equilibriums and the prisoner's dilemma, that really apply this concept of Nash equilibriums. Now let's start off with the Cournot model. In its simple form, we're looking at a duopoly model, so two firms in the industry. They're producing a homogeneous product, an identical product. Notice firms have market power. In other words, the quantities that they produce will affect the market price. Compare that, of course, to perfect competition, where that was not the case. Now notice both firms will determine the profit maximizing quantity for themselves, assuming the other firm will not change the quantity it produces. In other words, what they do is they estimate industry demand, they assume that their competitors' quantity is the same as the previous period, so they take the total industry quantity, deduct their competitors, and then look at profit maximization. So both firms are going to choose quantities simultaneously, and they have identical marginal costs of production. So let's have a look at what the model suggests. A is going to assume that firm B will produce the same quantity that it did in the previous period. Notice it then determines its demand curve by taking the market demand curve and subtracting firm B's quantity. Once it establishes its demand curve, it will then act as a monopoly and set its profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It's assuming, though, that B's quantity will remain constant. If B's quantity did change, then of course the issue for firm A is its demand curve would have changed. Now notice, therefore, that quantities produced by both firms are going to change each period until they're equal, because both firms are identical, so they should both end up with the same profit maximizing quantity. Notice both firms in the long run will choose Nash equilibrium output levels. They'll produce a level of, select a level of output which essentially maximizes their profit. No other level of output could give them a higher profit or a lower loss. Now notice this market price will be lower than monopoly, but higher than perfect competition. The more firms we add, essentially, the closer we get to perfect competition. As you add more and more firms, those economic profits are going to be competed away. Now let's have a look at oligopoly profits with collusion. Now, with collusion, what's going to happen is the players, the firms within the industry, are going to get together. They're going to establish the industry demand curve, the industry cost curve and marginal revenue curve, and from that, they're going to establish what is the profit maximizing level of production for the entire industry. What the players then do, of course, the firms then do, is they take that industry level of quantity and divide it up amongst them. So let's have a look at how it's going to play out. Marginal revenue, marginal cost for the industry, that determines industry quantity and price. Now, once the firms have got that, of course, what they're then going to do is divide that quantity up amongst them. We'll assume, two firms with an equal split here. So each firm produces half of the industry quantity. And notice that gives the firm its quantity. Draw up that quantity line until you hit average total cost, and continue extending until you hit, of course, price. And you can see we've got economic profit. In other words, we establish the industry quantity that maximizes economic profits for the industry, and we then divide that up. All the oligopolists are going to make economic profit in collusion, providing they don't cheat on the agreement, and that's going to come up next. Now look at perfect competition. We know we would have a lower price and a higher quantity. So the key here, of course, is economic profits would be eroded under perfect competition. Economic profits are sustainable in the long run under oligopoly. So under oligopoly, we have a higher industry price and a lower industry quantity than we would do under perfect competition. Now that takes us rather nicely to the prisoner's dilemma, which is really just a Nash equilibrium. Now, we've seen that oligopoly firms can generate greater profit if they collude, establish the industry profit maximising quantity that maximises economic profit in the industry and then divide it amongst them. However, game theory suggests that if competitors cannot detect cheating, and that's the key point, they cannot detect cheating, okay, so that's very critical, they will choose to violate the collusion agreement. In other words, they will increase their quantities slightly to sell more and make a bigger economic profit for them. The key, though, is if they increase their quantities, whilst they make a bigger economic profit, industry economic profit is eroded, and therefore their competitors are losing out. Okay, so let's have a look at the prisoner's dilemma. So you can see we've got two prisoners sitting in jail, both kept apart from one another. Prisoner A and prisoner B. Now, they've got a choice to confess or remain silent. Now, notice, if they both remain silent, they both get a 6 months jail term. If they both confess, they both get 2 years. However, if one confesses and one doesn't, the one that confesses goes free, the one that doesn't gets a 10-year jail sentence. Now, very critical here, you do not know what the actions of the other party are going to be. So let's say you're prisoner A, you're sitting in jail. You don't know whether the other party is going to confess or not. Now, what that means is our optimal decision becomes to confess ourselves if we don't know what our competitor is going to do. Why? Well, let's say prisoner B did remain silent. Well, if we confess, we will go free. Fantastic. So it's better. Now, of course, if prisoner B sorry, let me start that again. So we're saying if prisoner B is silent and we confess, we go free. That's a better outcome. Now, if prisoner B had confessed, but we remain silent, i.e. we stuck with the agreement, note that we get 10 years. And we're never going to want that, of course. So what do we end up doing? We end up going for the decision to essentially confess as well. And we both get 2 years. 2 years, of course, is better than 10 years. So notice, no matter what the situation is with my buddy who's in jail, my optimal decision will be to confess, will be to break the agreement. Now look, this is going to be the same when we apply it to industries now. Remember, the key point is you cannot detect what the other firm is doing here. Now notice, if both firms honour the collusion agreement, they both generate economic profit. But if you don't know whether the other party will stick to the agreement or not, notice that firm A's optimal decision will be to cheat. Because if firm B honours and they cheat, notice they get an increased economic profit. Now remember, the industry economic profit is being reduced though, so it's going to come at the expense of B making an economic loss. Notice, again, if firm B cheats, then again, firm A's optimal decision will be to cheat too, because that way you get 0 economic profit. If firm B cheats and you don't, you get economic loss. So firm A and firm B will always have an incentive to cheat. Now, what that means essentially is this point here represents our Nash equilibrium. If you can't detect people cheating on an collusion agreement, both people will cheat. That will increase quantity, and as quantity increases in the industry, down comes economic profits until essentially they are completely eroded. Okay, so let's just make that point one more time to make sure we're very clear. Okay, so we've got firm A honouring and firm B honouring. They both make economic profits of 225. Notice, if firm A then decides to cheat, it makes an economic profit, and firm B's economic profits are reduced. Now, of course, once firm B recognises its economic profits have been reduced, it will then retaliate and essentially cheat on the agreement and expand its quantity, until we end up at this situation where both firms make economic profit of 150. Notice what's happened here is economic profits have actually been reduced in the marketplace. If they both honoured the agreement, we would have had 450 of profit. Because they both broken the agreement, it's only 300. But it's a Nash equilibrium because now neither party can make any other move that could boost its profit. And notice it's exactly the same for firm B. If firm B cheats, then firm A will retaliate. So we end up at a Nash equilibrium. So in other words, there's always incentives for collusion agreements to be broken, especially if you can't detect who's cheating. So that certainly means that collusion will be more successful with fewer firms, less people to break the agreement. Homogeneous products, they're identical products, customers can switch between the two companies' products easily. Similar cost structures, and I think the key one here, certain and severe retaliation. There's got to be some penalty to you breaking the agreement. And then finally, little competition from firms outside the agreement. Well, of course, it's not going to work if other firms can enter. There's low barriers to entry, and they can enter and change the industry quantity. Remember, this is all about establishing the industry quantity and then dividing it up between the firms within the industry. Let's do dominant firm oligopoly here. You have one dominant firm who has the lowest costs, probably due to size and economies of scale. They're going to produce most of the output. Now notice we've got the market demand curve on here for the industry. What we're now going to do is put the dominant firm's demand curve on there and its marginal revenue curve. Now notice essentially that when prices are low, when prices are high and quantities are low, I wanted to do that in a highlighted colour, there's a fair difference between the dominant firm's demand curve and the market demand curve. Notice when prices are much lower, the difference is much smaller. In other words, the market demand curve is very similar to the dominant firm's demand curve. Why? Because when prices are lower, a lot of the competitors are going to go out of business. Remember, our dominant firm has the lowest cost. Okay, let's remove those highlighted bits. Okay, so next thing we need to do is put on the marginal cost curve of the dominant firm, and that will establish how much they're going to produce and the market price. Now, essentially, because of all the other firms are higher cost producers, they're going to have to accept this price. So let's put on their marginal cost curves, and again, where it crosses, essentially gives the quantity that the competitor firms are going to be able to produce. Okay, so essentially the dominant firm establishes its quantity and therefore market price. The competitor firms essentially are forced to accept that price, which will then determine their quantity where price intersects their marginal cost curve. Right, let's turn our attention now to monopoly, the most extreme. Now, with monopoly, of course, we're talking about a single producer here. And we're talking about, therefore, very high barriers to entry. And I see high barriers to entry, and immediately I'm thinking, sustainable economic profits, just like we had potentially with our oligopolies and duopolies. So what kind of barriers to entry are we looking for? Economies of scale are a classic one. Typically in industries with very, very, very high level of fixed costs. It's going to make it very difficult for new firms to set up because they have to incur all of that cost before they've established customers, essentially. We often refer to those as natural monopolies, industries with very high fixed costs, such as utility companies, for example. They may have higher barriers to entry because they have a patent or a legal agreement that prevents other firms copying their products. Or, of course, resource control. Now, with resource control, all we're simply saying is they control the factors of production, making it very difficult for somebody else to set up. Now, a single price monopolist, which we're going to start off with, which means they just sell at a single price, rather than using different prices for different customers, which we're going to talk about later, price discrimination, they face a downward sloping demand curve. And typically it's going to be relatively inelastic rather than elastic. Because they face a downward sloping demand curve, it means the only way you can increase quantity is to reduce price. Okay, So marginal revenue will be less than price and hence the demand curve. Okay, so we're going to look at two strategies, single pricing first of all, and then price discrimination. Now notice, first of all, when we look at this, the diagram looks remarkably similar to monopolistic competition. Yeah, I would expect the demand curve to be slightly more vertical than maybe monopolistic competition because it's less elastic. But apart from that, the diagram looks very similar. Now, of course, profit maximization for all firms is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So let's put that in. And, of course, extend the line up until it hits price to get our total revenue. Extend up from quantity until it hits average total cost to get total cost. And the difference between total revenue and total cost, of course, is our area of economic profit. Now, the critical point to note with monopoly is because of the very high barriers to entry, that economic profit can be generated in both the short run and the long run. Compare that to monopolistic competition, where because of the low barriers to entry, you could generate an economic profit in the short run, but that would increase competition, increase industry supply, and force prices down in the long run. Okay, so this is single price, single pricing. Then let's talk about price discrimination. Now let's talk about what it is first of all. Price discrimination means selling your goods, identical goods, at different prices to different customers. In other words, what we're going to try and do is divide the marketplace up into customers with different demand elasticities. To the customers that are relatively inelastic in their demand, we're going to charge a higher price, and to customers that are more elastic in their demand, we're going to charge a lower price. By doing that, what we're going to be able to see is that we're going to be able to increase the firm's essentially economic profits. The firm will be more profitable. Why? Because it's charging prices for customers that are equal to their marginal benefit. By doing that, what the firm is actually doing is it's taking consumer surplus and converting it to producer surplus. Okay, now of course, let's start off without our price discrimination. So they're going to price where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that gives you the price of 70 in our particular diagram. Okay, fair enough. Now, actually, let's just see. Do my lines animate? Yes, they do. Sorry. So notice, without price discrimination, they've got a cost of 70 and a price of 100. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That gives you profit maximizing quantity of 80. Extend the line up until you hit the demand curve to get price, 100 in this case. Where you hit your average total cost curve, go along to get total cost, 70. Okay, and you can see, therefore, that we're making $30 of economic profit per unit. 80 units, 30 times 80, a profit of 2,400. Now, with price discrimination, we're going to charge a higher price to people that have more inelastic demand. Okay, so different prices to different customers. Now, you probably experience this maybe on a daily basis yourself. With commuting, I commute in London, and you'll find that the price of a London Underground ticket is more expensive during the rush hour. So during 7 till 9:30, I think it is in the morning, the price is much more expensive. Why? Because you're looking at commuters, and they're essentially dependent on the transport to get to work, and therefore they have a relatively inelastic demand curve. So let's charge them a higher price. Now, of course, after the rush hour passes, then you're dealing with people that are much more elastic in terms of demand. So the price comes down to try and stimulate greater custom. So let's have a look at price discrimination. So we're going to charge one group of customers 110, another group of customers 90, and maybe a third group essentially 70. Now notice, therefore, that the economic profit we're making from the first group of customers, 110 less 70, 40 units times 50, 2,000 from then. And our second lot of customers, we're charging 90, so we're making an economic profit of 20. And that's, notice we're selling, how many there? 60 extra units, 60 times 20, 1,200. Key point is to notice the economic profit is higher, 3,200 compared to 2,400. Now, for this to work, we've got to be able to prevent resale between the groups. In other words, you don't want the customers where you sold at a low price to be able to resell to the customers with the higher price. Okay, so you've got to be able to prevent resale between the groups. And of course, the way it works with our commuting example is that cutoff is time itself that prevents resale. Okay, now, the argument then, if we logically extend this, is perfect price discrimination would be efficient because it'll eliminate the deadweight loss that we saw on the previous slide. We would charge each customer the maximum they would be willing to pay for each unit. So each customer gets a price equal to their marginal benefit. Now, what we'd find is there would be no deadweight loss there at all. We'd end up producing the same quantity as perfect competition. However, there would be no consumer surplus whatsoever. By charging each consumer their maximum price that they would be willing to pay, i.e. their marginal benefit, we've converted all of the consumer surplus into producer surplus. Okay, now let's compare monopoly to perfect competition. Okay, so let's have a look here. We've got our profit maximizing quantity for our monopolist. They'll produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Of course, that is where they're going to produce, extend to the demand curve. So what we're actually seeing, first of all, when we look at this diagram, is not the monopoly scenario, but perfect competition. Because remember, under perfect competition, okay, it's perfectly competitive, and therefore supply, which will be the firm's marginal cost curve, is equal to marginal benefit, which of course is the demand curve. And we talked about that, creating no deadweight loss. Now, of course, that establishes the perfectly competitive price, the industry price. And notice, therefore, that we have this triangular area of consumer surplus. And conversely, we would end up with this area of producer surplus. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to monopoly. Now, what monopoly is going to do is it's going to reduce the consumer surplus. It's going to increase the producer surplus relatively, but the two together will be lower. In other words, we're going to get a deadweight loss. So let's see that happening straight away. So with monopoly, profit maximization is now where marginal revenue equals the marginal cost curve. That establishes the monopoly price. Notice the area of consumer surplus is much smaller. If we were to look at the producer surplus, of course, we've got a much bigger area here. Okay. However, in aggregate, remember, it is inefficient because we've got our area now of deadweight loss. And remember, this is the total loss of surplus to the economy overall, because you're not producing where supply equals demand, where marginal cost, if you like, hits the demand curve. So producers may be better off, but society as a whole will be worse off under monopoly. Now, we then talk about natural monopolies. Now, natural monopolies, remember, have very high fixed costs. So what you tend to find is as output increases, average total cost declines. Why? Because remember, fixed costs are constant, bigger output, lower average fixed cost, and hence lower average total cost. So very, very high fixed cost industries, oil industries, utility companies, rail companies, with a lot of infrastructure, essentially. Marginal cost tends to be very low. The additional cost of producing one extra unit, it tends to be constant over time and pretty low. Okay. Now, what we're asked to be aware of is regulating monopolies using either average cost pricing, where you force them to charge a price equal to average total cost. Again, when you think price equals total cost, you should be thinking, ooh, no economic profit. Or marginal cost pricing. Now, here we could force them to price at a point where the marginal cost curve hits the demand curve. So marginal cost equals price. Now, the key point is that would be the same as perfect competition. You would be essentially producing where supply equals demand, and we know that that maximizes the consumer and producer surplus. However, what we might well find with marginal cost pricing is that the price is below average total cost, and therefore they may make a loss and require a subsidy. Let's have a look at it diagrammatically. Sorry. So here is our average total cost curve. Notice our average total cost curve, when we look at it, is just declining, declining, declining. It's just going down all the time. Okay, so notice our marginal cost curve for a natural monopolist tends to be pretty low, number one, and pretty constant over time, number two. The additional cost of producing an extra unit doesn't tend to change. Now, we're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, as a monopoly, of course. There we go. Extend it up until it hits the demand curve. That gives you your total revenue and price. Extend it up until it hits the average total cost curve, which gives you total cost. And the difference between total revenue and total cost, of course, is your economic profit. Now, let's have a look at average cost pricing. Now, average cost pricing, we're just going to force them to produce at a point where average total cost equals price. In other words, where average total cost hits the demand curve. Because then, price equals average total cost, so no economic profit. So it eliminates the economic profit. Now remember, our third scenario is to use marginal cost pricing. Now, marginal cost pricing will be where the marginal cost curve hits the demand curve. Remember, marginal cost above variable cost is supply. So we're looking at where supply hits demand. Now, of course, as we said, that's going to be allocatively efficient for the economy because it maximizes consumer and producer surplus. But look at what the issue would be for our firm. So there we are. Notice now price is below average total cost, so they've got an economic loss. And of course, that means they're going to go out of business unless they get a subsidy from the government. So let's finish this little bit by looking at a problem. What will be the effect on output and economic efficiency if a monopolist is able to employ price discrimination instead of charging a single price? Okay, now, of course, they are going to increase their output, we'll notice, and increase economic efficiency as it reduces the deadweight loss. Remember what we said, perfect price discrimination would have no deadweight loss whatsoever. Little bit we are asked here with a new LOS to describe the firm's supply function. Well, with perfect competition, we've talked about this already. We've said it is the marginal cost curve above average variable cost. Remember, below average variable cost, they just shut down. And of course, market supply is just the sum of the individual market participants' supply curves. Notice with monopolistic competition, oligopoly and monopoly, it's not so easy to define your supply function, because supply is no longer a function of price. Supply, of course, is now driven by marginal revenue equal marginal cost, giving you the profit maximizing quantity. That then is extended up to hit your demand curve that then gives price. In other words, supply is no longer a function of price. Price is now determined by marginal revenue and marginal cost. That determines price, which then, of course, determines quantity, determines supply, which then determines price. So in other words, in perfect competition, you've essentially got price determining quantity, whereas monopolistic competition, oligopoly and monopoly, you've got quantity determining price. Pricing strategies with perfect competition. Remember, you are a price taker. You have to accept the market price, charge a higher price, you get no customers at all and go out of business. Charge a lower price, you make economic losses and go out of business. Remember, with monopoly and monopolistic competition, we establish the profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenues equal marginal cost. That determines quantity. That then determines price by extending up, of course, to the demand curve. Now, oligopoly, of course, now our pricing strategy depends on how others are expected to react. And we saw the kinked demand curve, where we said if we increased our price, we end up very elastic. We decrease our price, we end up very inelastic because everybody copies. Dominant firm, where one firm establishes market price, and because they're the lowest cost producer, everybody has to follow. Game theory, that suggested any collusion would break down, and as a result, economic profits would be eroded until price equaled average total cost and economic profit was nothing. And collusion, that essentially suggested that if we could collude and didn't break the agreement, then essentially we would price where marginal revenue equaled marginal cost for the industry, which would establish economic profit and, of course, the industry price. We're coming towards the end of this reading, and we now need to describe market structure. Now, of course, price elasticity of demand is a good clue. Monopolies are getting closer to inelastic demand, and of course, perfect competition is very close to being perfectly elastic. Okay, so you could look at elasticity of demand. You notice analysts must estimate both demand and supply functions. So we could estimate price elasticity, and remember we computed it in an earlier reading. We could, of course, use a multiple regression where we argue that the quantity demanded is a function of price, incomes, prices of competitor goods, etc. We would need a large number of observations collected over time in order to do this regression, time series analysis. And the problem is when you collect data over time, that data may capture trends that no longer exist. In other words, the coefficients that you calculate, your slope coefficients, may have changed because the future may not replicate the past. And we call that coefficient instability. We could attempt to do regression analysis cross-sectionally, remember, which means looking at a lot of firms at the same point in time. Okay. Of course, again, lots of data being collected here. And of course, using slightly different measures of your independent variables gives you very dramatically differing results. So regression analysis is a possibility to identify market structure. N-firm concentration ratio. All we're going to do is look at the combined market share of the N largest firms. And now you can see your advantage here is, yeah, well, it's easy. Just add up the market share of the N largest firms, assuming you know what their market share is. Well, notice we're going to calculate their market share as their sales divided over the total market sales. Now, an N-firm ratio that's very, very small means we must be very close to perfect competition. Of course, an N-firm that's 100% would represent a monopoly. So basic idea here is lower ratios are more competitive, higher ratios are closer to monopoly and oligopoly. Major disadvantages, it ignores barriers to entry. In other words, I don't care if I have a monopoly if there are low barriers to entry. Why? Because then if that monopoly generated economic profit, it would attract competitors that would erode those economic profits down over time. Okay, so it's only an issue if you have one player in the industry if you have high barriers to entry. And of course, these barriers to entry are ignored by this ratio. Secondly, it's largely unaffected by mergers. Now, in other words, if the two biggest producers in your marketplace merge together, it would have a very small impact on the N-firm ratio. Now, one way of getting around the merger issue is to calculate not N-firm, but something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And again, I would stress it's important to be able to interpret Herfindahl-Hirschman, so these numbers are going to be important. What you do is you square the market share of the N largest firms, or all the firms if you could get hold of that data. So you're going to take their market share as a decimal, square it, and then sum it together. Now, what you get is a very low Herfindahl-Hirschman with perfect competition. Okay, so we'd expect something below 0.1. A result of 0.1 to 0.18, we're talking about moderate competition, and above 0.18, it's an uncompetitive market. Notice, of course, by definition, if you were looking at a monopoly with one firm, it would have a market share of 100%, i.e. 1, square 1, you end up with 1. So 1 would be the result from monopoly. Okay, now, significance. It's going to be a lot more sensitive to mergers than the N-firm ratio because we're squaring these amounts. It is used by regulators. In particular, it's enshrined in antitrust regulation in the US, i.e. competition regulation in the US. Still, however, ignores barriers to entry. And of course, we haven't thought about demand elasticity either. So again, is it a problem if you have an uncompetitive industry if they have an elastic demand curve? Probably not. Our issues are when you've got an uncompetitive industry and less elastic demand, because of course then we're going to start to see economic profits being generated. Right, okay, let's finish our reading off with a little question. A market where individual producers face downward sloping demand, barriers to entry are low, and producer pricing decisions are not directly affected by the decisions of other producers is, let's think about it, an oligopoly? No, not oligopoly, because remember, they are affected by the decisions of other producers. Remember the idea of an oligopoly, understand the industry demand, okay, and then essentially base everything from that. You don't know your firm demand curve because it's affected by the actions of your competitors. Perfect competition? Well, again, it's not going to be perfect competition. Barriers to entry are low. Well, that would be fine for perfect competition. Pricing decisions are not affected by pricing decisions of others. That would be fine. The problem is downward sloping demand curve. Perfect competition is perfectly elastic and therefore horizontal. So our answer therefore has to be C by a process of elimination, monopolistic competition, downward sloping demand curve, still pretty elastic though, downward sloping demand curve, of course, low barriers to entry, conclusions can't generate economic profits in the long run.